Okay, Justice Strategy and Alliances, Module 5. We're really chewing through. We're coming up for halfway pretty soon. All right, this week's theme is around urban cultures and culture change. Now, I haven't found a better title than urban cultures. My problem is that it sounds like we're talking about hipsters and cliches. But I'm not really. I'm talking about the cultures around cities, particularly the cultures around the governance and justice systems of the city. But I couldn't find a nice, easy, concise way of saying it. So for the moment I'm saying urban cultures, but don't be fooled into thinking that I'm really talking about sort of urban street subcultures, which you might have thought was a much more interesting topic, but what we're talking about here is the different cultures different cities have around the way they're organised and the way things get done. And that plays heavily not only into your choice of strategies, but one of the strategies that's available in your toolkit is culture change. It's a very important one because often cities' problems come from entrenched beliefs, entrenched ways of doing things, old ways of doing things, and the cultures that support those and form resistance to change. Now, one of the most extreme examples of this that we look at in the notes is corruption. And remember, this is a problem not just in issues of corruption, it's a problem all the way through where systems are inefficient or don't work well or don't cooperate. But corruption, I guess, is the thing that you'll end up with if you're not careful. And obviously some ways of organising, some ways of doing business, some ways of doing government are more conducive to corruption than others. And I've extracted some areas from the Coldrake report, which is quite a recent report, on corruption in Queensland, a state that has had a long and painful history of civil corruption and anti-corruption activity, and a series of strategies that might be used to try and avoid that corruption. So this is, I think, an example of, I don't know if extreme is the right word for it, but high-end culture change, high-end strategy, high-end intervention, where you've got things like secrecy, lack of transparency, lack of accountability, all these problems in the culture that really do need immediate and abrupt attention. There needs to be something done, and it can't be, well, in the future we'd like to move towards a more transparent form of government. It really needs to be now. We need to make changes. And I think that's an example of one end of the spectrum when it comes to culture change. The other end of the spectrum, you have culture change that is much more, it's slower paced, it's gentler, but it's designed to try and ease from one culture to another. Now, problem with that long-term light touch culture change is the people who are doing the culture change may be gone before you get the culture change done. You may lose track of the project. It's certainly not an ideal way of doing culture change, but it is a recognition that sometimes it takes time, sometimes it even takes generations for starting to change the way in which people operate. And we see that in a lot of social issues. Particularly with the emergence of things like civil rights and recognition of rights of different groups of people. There's always a strategic disagreement between those at the one hand who want to push things as fast as possible and then run the risk of creating a backlash from people because they don't like being changed or being forced to change. And the other extreme, people who go, oh, look, we'll just gently introduce change, and then change never really happens. And the sweet spot is, of course, somewhere in the middle, where you have active change that's meaningful, that really sees results, but also a strategy that thinks about, well, what do you do about the reactions? What do you do about the people who say, what about my right to free speech? What about my right, blah, 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 that you actually encompass those. Okay, so depending on the field that you are operating in, Exact strategies are going to differ. And often I talk about in the notes in the idea of unlearning. That it's often because culture is something that's learned, it's not something that's innate. Often you need strategies to try and relearn new ways of doing things, but also unlearn the strategies that have previously been successful. Now, an example of that in many areas of governance is the boys' club. It's a form of adaptation which has been successful for people on the inside of the boys' club for a long time. It's provided a whole lot of short pathways to recruitment for people who are the beneficiaries of it. The people who are involved in the boys, the old boys network, who recruit people from their old private schools or whatever, they feel the benefit that they are getting a known quantity of applicants, that they can appoint people in positions that they already know what they're like and what they're about because they're people who are known to them. You see a different variation on this in policing, where you see the sort of comradeship, the masculine comradeship of people facing difficult circumstances, the band of brothers culture, but that of course can very easily go into negative and toxic places, where you have things like corruption growing because you don't dob on someone who's a mate, who's a member of the club. And the Fitzgerald inquiry commented quite often on that whole way that ideas of mateship permeated corruption in police and politics in Queensland. The way that people had to really fight to earn respect within that kind of culture, but then they risked losing everything by betraying or exposing someone who was corrupt within that culture. So most circumstances are not going to have something that extreme or something that's that identifiable, but you will see that organisations still have little quirks, little cultures, different ways of doing things. Sometimes they're reproducing pathological things in society more generally, such as prejudice, such as patriarchal structures or whatever. And sometimes they're very particular to a particular organisation. We've always done things this way is one thing that's very frustrating for people who are trying to make change. You can present people with a much more efficient way of doing something that is better for them, and they will still say, oh, but I've been doing this for 25 years this way. I don't want to change the way in which I do things. And yeah, it'll take you half the time to do it. Oh, yeah, but I've been doing it for 25 years, So there are all sorts of variants of these localized cultures. And generally, a strategy of culture change has to accompany any of the more substantial strategies of change within organisation, between organisations, all those other things that we're going to be looking at this term. So as a part of any change strategy, you kind of bolt on as an extra a culture change plan that involves an assessment of the things in the, and I think you should be looking at the good and bad things about an existing culture. There's a risk of just saying that a culture is pathological. And even those corrupt cultures, it's really useful to look at the things that were adaptive about them and the things that worked for people that were in those cultures. You don't have to somehow, accept or approve of those corrupt cultures to do that. But I think it's really important to understand that the reason it worked is because there were incentives and benefits built into that system. And some of them were obvious, bribe money. And some of them were less obvious, about being part of a membership of a particular group, being part of an elite group that was different from other people, all these other aspects that actually induce people into these kind of pathological cultures. So you need to start your culture change plan to start with a thorough analysis of the existing culture, a forecast of the kind of culture you want to move for, and then strategic steps you want to do to get on the way. And I've seen this done well, and I've seen this done badly. And when you see it done badly, this is the domain of the vision statement and the values statement and all this ridiculous nonsense that people go away on retreats and they play egg and spoon races and they make bridges out of spaghetti and look, I have been there and done that way too many times in organisations I've been part of, and this side of simplistic idea of, well, if everyone went off and had fun if you call any of those things fun for a day, then everyone will get on better, and you'll sort out all the wrinkles in organisational culture, and everyone will agree. But generally speaking, culture is a much more sophisticated and difficult thing to change. It's a whole profession. I think it's one of these things that on a large scale, particularly businesses, actually get outsiders in to as consultants to help them with culture change. One that I remember that I do think was successful, that was a part of a bank I knew about, was an ask once policy. And it was moving towards a cultural change of saying, if someone has a question, you take responsibility over the question, the follow-up, finding the right person, delivering the answer back to the person. Because that bank had that problem of people would ring up with customers would ring up with an issue, and someone would say, oh, it's not my problem, it's not my issue. Or you've got to talk to Joe about that, and he's not in on Fridays. Or leave it with me, and I'll find out. And then there's no follow through. So they instituted this just ask once idea, in the idea that it would be more satisfying for customers and also for people who worked in the bank to develop this sort of relationship with customers where you'd go, okay, I'm an empowered person. This person has a question. I'm empowered to go and find out the answer for them and get back to them. And that was a substantial culture change. And there was a lot of sort of team building and stuff that was done around that. But it was also backed up, I think, with a fairly hard set of regulatory guidelines that if you were doing the just ask once and you were trying to help someone out and someone didn't help you, then there would be consequences, and there'd be consequences for their managers and up the chain. So culture change can involve sort of the two ends. There's sort of the light end where you give everyone a new mug that says our values are this, just ask once, and then there's the hard edge part of it where it's like, well, your performance is contingent on you actually being supportive of this new initiative, and there were consequences not just for individuals who breach that policy, but for managers who do not encourage their group to follow that policy. So again, when we're talking about the material we looked at last week in terms of alliances and so on, it can involve a significant amount of culture change away from an old, insular, isolated way of approaching problem solving to one where people actually feel better about those changes. They actually feel committed to and internalize those values. Not easy to do. Now, the reading this week's a bit different from the others. It's an urban studies reading from the attempts to create a right to the city in Mexico City. It's an odd and interesting little journey. It's not one that I think you're going to be able to sort of take notes necessarily of all that many key points. So just read it for the journey through the story, and I think wait till you get to the end, till you start sort of connecting the points and making your notes. Not that I think it's a difficult reading or by any means, but I think it's one that if you think, I want to go through and I want to make notes on paragraph 1 and notes on paragraph 2 and notes on paragraph 3, you'll find a little thwarting, because it's actually the story of this attempt, perhaps successfully, to embed this fundamental urban right that involved a change to culture, a change to policing culture, a change to governmental culture. And the workshop this week, the challenge for the workshop, is tying a lot of these things together and looking at the cultural aspect to change from a different perspective. So we've previously been on the side of the angels, really, looking at the way in which we can try and change things to improve things, to foster stronger strategies, better systems, more collaboration. This week we are playing the baddies. We're looking at the forces of corruption that actually resist change, or that try to make matters worse. If they're trying to involve in change, it's not the good form of change. They're trying to make matters worse. So we're looking at an example of a development issue and the involvement of various forms of power in trying to shape this development in a way that'll suit their interests, both business interests, personal enrichment, a little bit of organised crime in there as well, a little bit of pathological social change. But sometimes this is getting back to what I said about earlier about the adaptive parts of corruption and being able to actually understand what it is that people benefit from out of corruption without endorsing it, without supporting what they do. This is a good example to do that, to look at why it is so hard to try and do anything in the public sector and why it is that these forces of corruption are so strong. And I think last year the students quite enjoyed this and quite enjoyed the opportunity to be the bad guys for a change. All right, we will deal with that in class when we come to it, and I will see you there.